Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today's guest, Caitie Whelan, has been a congressional staffer in both the U.S. Senate and House and was a strategic communications advisor for one of President Biden's major global climate initiatives. Currently, she is a consultant who helps clients get more deeply engaged in affecting policy decisions on the issues they care about. Actually, Catie explains that this passion for issues, for improving people's lives, she sees that commitment and determination as the secret sauce of advocacy, especially when it comes to the stamina necessary for the long haul often entailed in making change. I wanted to talk to Catie particularly because of her role guiding people into this work and helping them climb the learning curve of policy change advocacy. I love the way she breaks down the fundamentals with core questions about who has the power to do what the advocates want, what is a story that'll help spur those politicians to take that desired action, and how to sustain the effort for years to come. Catie views her work as democracy promotion in the sense of helping citizens engage with their government on the 364 days of the year besides Election Day. In our current difficult times, Catie gives us a much-needed pep talk. My guest today is Caitie Whelan, who has a consulting practice as a civic strategist, drawing especially on her experience as a congressional staffer. The best way to describe that civic strategist role is Caitie's wonderful tagline. She describes her work as giving folks the tools to make public policy for the people. I should also mention that Catie publishes an excellent newsletter called Policy is for Lovers, which I highly recommend. In terms of how we met, Catie is living proof that you can make great connections using college alumni networks. She gets full credit for finding me and getting in touch based on the instinct that we seem to share a lot of interests in terms of work and career path. She was, of course, absolutely right, which is why I'm especially glad to have you here. Thanks so much for being on my pod, Catie.
Oh, it's my joy, David. Thank you.
Now, your work entails what I've started thinking of as meta advocacy. That is, advocacy to persuade more people to do that type of work on behalf of their issues or organizational missions. That's where I'd like to start the conversation today. This is such a great vantage on the work. Getting people who stayed away from policy change advocacy, getting them to dive right into the arena. So, as you've played this role, what have you learned about some of the, I guess, self-imposed barriers to entry?
It's a great question. And there might be some self-imposed barriers that some folks struggle with, but there are some societal ones too. So I'll start in a slightly different place, which is, we live in a representative democracy. And one of the core promises of American democracy is that we get to have a say in how we're governed. But it's like we've been given a toolbox that has one tool in it, and that tool is voting. And you wouldn't buy a toolbox that just has a hammer in it, right? And so for me, what I want to do is expand that toolbox for folks, right? Because democracy is a 365-day project. It doesn't just happen once on an election day. There are 364 other days where democracy is active. And if we're not participating in it, special interests and lobbyists usually are. And to be real, like some of those special interests and lobbyists are doing things that we might love and agree with. And some of them are not too, right? So I'm really interested, David, in what happens between elections, because that's when the bills that become the laws that we live under get written. And if we don't know how to have a seat at that policymaking table, other folks and other very powerful folks usually do. And so I think one of the things that's a little bit more structural about folks' ability to participate, or folks' capacity, or seeing themselves as having the capacity to participate in democracy beyond voting, or beyond also too that click this link to send an email to your senator or your state legislator, or click this link to read this script, and for whether it's a state politician or a politician in DC. I think one of the challenges is we haven't been taught to see ourselves as kind of year-round participants in the democratic process, right? If we were lucky to have a civic education, and it was a good civic education, oftentimes what that is there are 3 branches of government, you get a little whiff of federalism, and don't forget to vote and serve on a jury. And that's wonderful, but it's not really enough sort of like gas in the tank to build up our confidence to be able to know like something as foundational as like who even has the power to do what I want. When I worked in Congress, I would sometimes get calls, or we would sometimes get calls from constituents asking us to do something about the death penalty or the public school curriculum. But Congress actually can do very little about those issues, right? I mean, one of the pieces of federalism, it's a decentralized power structure, right? So the death penalty is mostly a state issue, and public school curricula is mostly local, though for sure states are playing more and more in that space. And so, if we haven't even been taught who has the power to do to make the change that we want, and we reach out to the wrong level of government and they say, well, we actually can't do that, it can either 1, compound our sense that government doesn't work and we disengage, or 2, leave us feeling frustrated and not really knowing where to turn. And it is true that democracy dies in a multiplicity of ways, but one of the ways that I don't think we talk about enough is disengagement. Democracy dies by apathy to participants. And then I think the other piece is it's really daunting. Like, just to read the headlines coming out of DC, it can be baffling to think where you even start. And I think a lot of folks have the experience of either calling their senator, their House member, whether at the state or federal level, and feeling like they're just kind of spitting in the wind, right? Maybe they never hear back, or maybe they get a form letter back. And that also is that's a depressant on participation. So I see this work foundationally, David, as a power democratization project, right? Which is building democratizing access to democratizing access to people's participation in policy making, and helping all of us better understand the landscape that policy is made in, so we can figure out how to participate with the least amount of effort, sort of with minimum effort and maximum impact.
When you meet people where they are they already at the point of being clear the change they're seeking, or is there still some clarifying there?
I think for some folks, that I work with, the question might start off broadly, of I want to increase funding for affordable housing. And then it gets a little bit more specific. I want to increase funding for Section 8 housing. I want to increase, housing density. I want less zoning incentives or less incentives for zoning that benefits developers, and, or whatever form it takes. But I think usually it's a broad question that kind of can get sort of tailored down to getting to the specific issue that someone wants to address. But, honestly, David, by the time someone has found me, they already have the secret sauce to policymaking, which is that they care. Like, I could teach you any number of great policy tools, but I cannot teach you how to care, because care is what is going to drive. Care is the engine of any good policy change, because policy change takes a long time. By design, and yes, also, there's partisanship and, one party not wanting to give another party a win, but sometimes the victory is changing a should to a shall. It's very incremental progress, right? And if we care, that's going to sustain us through the really slow bore work of changing, the laws that we live under and creating more just and kind and generous and equitable ones. So out of the gates, anybody who I'm working with has the foundational ingredient, right? And then it's how do we operationalize that care in service of what matters most? The things that I'm always thinking about and that I'm always working with folks is figuring out who has the power to do what we want. How do we tell a story that they can say yes to? And then how do we sustain ourselves in that work, right? Because it's going to take a while. Like my favorite example of this, David, is hospice, right? So back in the 1970s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with the stages of grief, goes over to the United Kingdom, and she sees people dying not in a hospital, but in their homes or in these facilities. And she goes and she testifies before the U.S. I can't remember the exact title of it, but there's the U.S. Senate Committee on Aging. And she says, we could never have this in the United States. It's state subsidized. And the concept of hospice in America at that point was totally unfamiliar. For the most part, people either died in tragedy or in hospitals, right? And so a couple of senators one was a Democrat from Idaho, if you can imagine, named Frank Church, introduces a bill on hospice. And that bill goes absolutely nowhere. So then other bills get introduced over the course of the next couple of years. And then Senator Ted Kennedy and Bob Dole request a study on would hospice be eligible for, I think it was just Medicare funding. I don't think it was Medicaid at that point. And then I think it was 1982, but don't quote me on that date, about 10 years from the time that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross testifies before the U.S. Senate, hospice funding, like a hospice benefit for Medicare gets folded into an omnibus bill. So 10 years, right, from a word that's completely unfamiliar in the American lexicon to something that now, is, all 50 states have it, and is, I think, both Medicare and Medicaid gets coverage through both of those. So this process takes time, and too many great pieces of policy are sitting in the dustbin of history because the advocate burned out or got cynical. And so, yes, the first two pieces of what I do are important, right? Figuring out who has the power to do what we want, and how do we tell them a story they can say yes to. But that third piece of how do we sustain the work, I would say is just as important, if not more important, than those first two, which are sort of tactical and strategic. But the other part is more kind of that, like, for lack of a better way of saying it, that spiritual sustenance, so that we can stay the long course through the ebbs and flows of political change and majority and minority switching and all of that.
Okay, so the secret sauce, the sine qua non is that caring. Mm-hmm. But surely those are important calculations and decisions about what you're going for. No?
For some people, it's, I want to get the assault weapons ban passed. Well, you can do that both on the state level and you can do it on the federal level. Like, where is usually what I like to start with is where is there some lower hanging fruit, right? And for most folks, it's going to be, there's more of a conversation to be had or to be started, or a bill to move a little bit further forward. Not always, but on the state level, right? And at the very least, particularly, I say this with a real sensitivity to folks in states where absolutely there's going to be no movement of an assault weapons ban bill. But at the very least, there can be statements from politicians made, whether statements for the record or press releases, things that individuals and organizations can point to show a growing momentum and enthusiasm for this as an issue. And then some folks, have a sense of like, I want to do, I think this is particularly true for liberal and progressive folks after the election of like, I want to do something because I feel powerless. And so then it's sort of figuring out like, what is the landscape within which you want to do something, right? Is it understanding who I reach out to about certain issues? Is it figuring out, if I could change one thing, it would be around this issue? Really concrete example, and this was actually the catalyst for me launching this work. So a friend reached out to me. I'll back up a little bit. I had been doing communications and operations for one of President Biden's global climate initiatives. And the day the president announced the initiative, my eldest brother died by suicide. And it, a massive rupture in your life like that lays a lot of things bare. And one of the things it laid bare was that I am not the most effective in big bureaucracies. I have massive respect for people who are, because if you can make change from within there, you can impact tens, if not hundreds of millions of people's lives. But that's not where my skill sets are the most effective. And my brother's death sort of helped me to see that. And so I was lucky I could take a little bit of a sabbatical and figure out where I wanted to point my bow. And during that time, I got a call that kind of inverted everything for me, David. A friend reached out to me and she said, I want to get the assault weapons ban passed before Congress adjourns. I've called our two senators here in Maine. Would you do the same? And I said, I love your enthusiasm. Let's actually look at where the bill is in the legislative process and figure out what needs to happen to get it to the next stage. Because the subtext is, which I didn't say, is it's not going to be calling our two senators. Because how could my friend know that? Nobody had ever told her that. She was using the tools that she had been given, right? And so we talked through, what needs to happen to get the bill to the next stage in the process. And I finished that conversation. And I said to myself, I am done with good people not knowing how government works. Because there are people who know how government works, and they're really good at making it work for their special interest. And I want to redistribute, or at least democratize access to power to someone like my friend, who wants to drop her kiddo off at school and not have that horrible thought run through her mind, right, as she's pulling away. And then there are some people who are just banging their head against the wall, trying to figure out, what can I do about this thing that is impacting my daily life, right? And we all have those things, right? Maybe it's medical debt. Maybe it's, they're going to build a parking lot over this, open space, right? That could actually be a park, or maybe it's underfunding the libraries and the public schools and, worried about resource distribution in our town. And usually the thing that gets them to me, that is that care of like, all right, enough is enough. Like, we've got to do something. I want to be giving people these translatable tools that don't just help them on this one particular issue, this assault weapons ban, right? I want them to have it for any number of different things, right? So I'm thinking specifically and concretely about that issue, but I'm also thinking about, how do we universalize this? Like, how do we take these tools, like, how am I communicating in this a way that these tools are just as useful for an assault weapons ban as it would be for a universal summer meals program, or whatever form it takes? Because I want as many people as possible to be walking around with a sense that their voice matters in the small d democratic process, which means they don't need to depend on me. They can get those foundational skills and then let her rip, like go out into the wild and make really good policy change, or get started making really good policy change.
Tell us a little bit about, what that looks like when they become empowered, when they start to sort of feel their oats and build that capacity, as you described it before.
Well, what I'd love to tell you, David, is that tons and tons of policy has changed as a result of this work. But I can't tell you that, because that policy change, as we discussed, is long haul. And I've only been at this really sort of formally for about a year. But what I can tell you is folks will circle back to me and they'll share what they're working on. And I can tell they are asking the right questions. I'm not teaching people answers. I am teaching them the questions to ask, because once you know the questions to ask, who has the power to do what I want? How do I tell a story that they can say yes to? They can begin, and I've given them enough of the tools to answer those, like to figure out the answers to those questions. They're off to the races, right? So I had one person I worked with who was working on better understanding kind of like the power mapping in Congress. And they did a lot of great work and then circled up with me a couple months later. And the question they asked was completely indicative of like this applied knowledge, right? And the question, like what they were asking me was kind of the sort of like 401 level. Like we've done the 101, we've done the 201, and now we're at the 401 level of like really thinking about this beyond analytically. But now we're playing, like, as folks always talk about Nancy Pelosi, we're playing three-dimensional chess here, right? And, I think that like there's, so I work with folks both on earmarks and for people who are not familiar, earmarks is federal money that, senators or House members secure for nonprofit and local and state government projects in their districts. So I'll work with folks on earmarks and their ability to, a lot of people who work in development have not been given any training on earmarks. And so for them to have more tools to then go through the earmark process again on their own and not need anything from me, but know how to build the relationships, who to talk to in the staff, in the politician's like office, like what the staffer is that does this, how to give the staffer the information they need, right?
Them there. And I've noticed also, the newsletter, you talk a lot about sort of, I don't know, this zoology, this strange animal of a political level decision maker, right? Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like some of the work is, some of that empowerment and capacity building work is helping people navigate that or interact with it.
We don't talk about empathy and care much in policymaking, but I would argue that those are two sort of foundational ingredients. The empathy to understand where the landscape a politician is operating in, right? Because politicians are always negotiating multiple different constituencies, right? They're the folks who vote for them. And this is always going to be especially pronounced for politicians who are up for re-election. You have your voters. And then for state and federal, you also have your party, right? Because politicians exist in some kind of relationship with their party, especially if they're in a district that is... a more, let's say a more purple district, right? Where it's not overwhelmingly blue or overwhelmingly red, right? So your relationship to your party. And then there's also your relationship to your party leader, right? So for Republicans in the US Congress, the constituencies they're navigating are their voters, right? Back in their district, their party, and then the incoming Trump administration, right? And sometimes those things are in tension. Right. I think we could probably name a couple of US senators right now for whom some of those things are not totally in alignment. The more that we can understand about the political landscape that a politician is navigating, and for me, that requires a little bit of empathy, right? The more that I can then begin to think about how can I frame an ask that fits into that reality. Right? How can I tell a story that is relevant to the landscape the politician is operating in? And a piece of this is always going to be the three most powerful words in policymaking that largely go unaddressed are vote your district. And so if what you are pitching to a politician might be in opposition to one of the constituencies that a politician has to navigate, right? So maybe it's counter to what the rest of their party is doing. If you can frame it in a way that is like, this is representative of a significant percentage of the district, and you have to do that authentically, you cannot BS anybody. But if you can demonstrate that this is reflective of some district priorities, you've just told a fairly compelling story that the politician can in turn go around and say, you know what, I'm not in a position to do this. This is going to affect my reelection because a certain number of people in my district are not supportive of this or are supportive of this, right? So that's one of the things I think a lot about is I think right now there are a lot of folks in the progressive and liberal space experiencing a certain amount of whiplash from, oh my gosh, this nomination, oh my gosh, this day one pledged action, oh my gosh, this 100 days. It is drinking from a fire hose trying to track all that's coming out of DC right now. And so my recommendation is, it's funny, I just wrote about this. When I was younger, my mom took a nail, hammered it into the kitchen wall, and hung up the Serenity Prayer. And, that's grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And forgive me if I butchered that about a little bit. So my thinking is if you are feeling overwhelmed by your news consumption, if it feels like it is just this constant stream of bad news bears, then focus on the things you can change, which are the politicians who represent you. Because if you ever have a question about who has the power to do what we want, the answer is always going to be the politician who represents you. Whether or not you agree with them or whether or not you voted for them, we live in a representative democracy, and their job is to represent our voice in Congress. And this becomes harder when we are ideologically very misaligned with that politician. But think about it. All of us have 3 voices in Congress. We have 2 senators and we have 1 House member. For some of us, none of those voices are resonant for us. And I hold you in that. That is a hard place to be. I would recommend for those feeling overwhelmed to focus your news consumption on the politicians who represent you. Because the more we understand about what they're thinking and feeling and doing, the more that we can frame an ask that they can say yes to. And politicians are beholden to their constituents. They depend on their constituents for reelection. And so we have more agency with them. We have a little bit more leverage with them than we do with, I think oftentimes people will call like current majority leader Chuck Schumer or House Speaker Mike Johnson. If you don't live in New York, if you don't live in Mike Johnson's, which is where Schumer is from, if you don't live in Mike Johnson's Louisiana district, it's not worth your time. Call the people who represent, call the politicians who represent you.
Okay, so that's calling, but what does that say about your about information consumption, right? If that's the filter of kind of focusing on, your own representatives as opposed to the nationwide, leader. As particularly with the decline of local newspapers. Where does that leave us as our kind of best methods for tracking that?
Well, I would say actually, if you still have one, get the subscription to your local newspaper. I've actually been giving that away as holiday presents. I mean, there's a wonderful line about the role of good journalism is to hold power to account. And some of us still actually do have local newspapers, and they are struggling. The number of State House journalists has declined 34% since 2014. It is not our job to track everything that politicians are doing. That's journalists' job. We can outsource that to them. It is our job to digest what they are giving us, and then figure out what we want to do with it. The other reason that I would say local journalism is so important is it comes in at a slightly more human pace, right? So I'm reading my local paper, and it's got a story about how one of my senators met with the Secretary of Defense nominee. And it also has a story about this holiday light festival that's happening. And it's got a story about how my town just acquired a 34-acre parcel of land. And it's got a story about this pizza place that's opening. Like, it's coming. It is both a civic and community resource, which is much more humane to digest than 24-hour news. So there's great radio, local radio that you can listen to, hopefully. Or then maybe it's just figuring out, like, what are the outlets where my people are being covered, right? Or even just doing like, a Google alert or any kind of alert for the stuff that covers your person. But the nature of what's happening in Congress right now is that Congress is 535 members, 100 in the Senate, 435 in the House. There is going to be coverage on all of them. The national news is going to cover a much smaller number of them, but there will be some kind of coverage on almost all of them. And I think if you want to be informed about the world without feeling like you're being swallowed whole by the news of the world, that's one approach. But I couldn't be a bigger champion of like nonpartisan local journalism. And the more that we invest in it, the more resources they have to cover what's happening both at the state, local, and federal level, which is just a way of outsourcing a huge chunk of our work. So we don't have to get into the nitty gritty of going to our state legislature's website to see what the Judiciary Committee is going to be holding a hearing on next Tuesday.
Well, when we arranged to record this and have this conversation, I I thought that it would be great to hear that perspective of someone who is uh, working with people, kind of coming into their deeper engagement with all of this, and that's a fascinating vantage point, and really enjoyed hearing all about how you do that and how that goes. So thanks again for doing this.
Thanks so much, David. And I thank you to everybody listening. And I will end with one of my mom's favorite quotes, which comes from the historian Howard Zinn. Let's see if I can get it right. He says, "The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live in defiance of all that is bad around us is itself a marvelous victory." So it's been a pleasure to be with you, David. Thanks so much.
Thanks for helping us keep it in the big picture.